back to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over the basics of knitting as told by a crocheter. Before we get into the actual meat of the video, I thought I would start with some background. I started knitting at 18 just on a whim. I saw a YouTube video and I was like, that's kind of cool. I tried it. I would do things like scarves and swatches, hats, and my technique absolutely sucked. There were so many pieces that either had like drop stitches, which resulted in like holes or like uneven sides. And I was just kind of struggling through overall getting my technique to go be better and better because I didn't know like where to go resource wise. And I was kind of like sporadic and in and out of it because I was kind of busy. Throughout this time, I was recommended crochet, and people would say things like, oh, it's easier. And I think if you like this, you'll like that as well. And I was kind of stubborn about it. And so it took me like 1.5 years to do it overall because I was just like, no, I'm gonna keep knitting. Finally, I did try it and I kind of liked it. I liked the fact that it did seem a little bit easier. But more than that, I could finish things faster and quicker. But I did have, especially in the beginning, similar issues to what I had when I was knitting, where as long as I wasn't working on my technique and getting the fundamentals down, my projects were not coming out. Like the quality was just not there. So that's finally when I decided to dedicate one whole and full summer to just really getting those techniques down, working on gauge swatches, learning everything that I can that there is to know about crochet so that I could have better results when it came to finishing my projects. That worked, and by the end of the summer, I wouldn't say that I was a pro, but I would definitely say that I was much better than when I went into the summer. Fast forward, and now I would say that I'm pretty proficient. I can do I can do projects that are both beginner friendly up to advanced. I do a lot of freehand pieces, and I would say that I have a pretty good grasp on the different aspects of crochet itself. About a year ago, in fact, because I wasn't bored, but I definitely did miss knitting, especially since that's where I started. And so I dedicated myself to trying to, similar to what I did with crochet and picking up those fundamentals, to do the same thing with knitting, which thus leads us here today because I know that crochet and knitting are synonymous crafts. And so I really wanted to make a video and put information out there kind of speaking to people who maybe are in a similar boat, or in this case, the reverse boat, where maybe you've started with crochet, you're pretty good at crochet, but you're kind of curious about knitting, so that you can just sort of learn what the differences are, what are the similarities, and decide if you really and truly want to go down that rabbit hole, or if you're already decided, maybe you can have a little bit of a leg up with what exactly you're going to need to inform yourself on, what kind of hooks or needles you're going to need to buy, that kind of stuff. My overall objective is to introduce the concept or practice of knitting, which, as I said before, is kind of noted as a sister craft to crochet. But I want to do this in a way that's both beginner friendly, if you're completely starting from like point zero, you haven't even crocheted before, but also specifically translate from those who maybe do have crochet backgrounds. So I'm going to start by reviewing the key similarities and differences between knitting and crochet. Then I'm going to explain the primary tools that you would use for knitting, introduce common knitting stitches, and then finally end off by providing some resources that might aid you in your knitting journey. So let's get started. I've created a Venn diagram that sort of outlines both the ways in which crochet and knitting are different. As you can see, there's a good amount, as well as the key similarities and probably the reasons why these two crafts are pretty synonymous with each other. So let's start with, the smaller of the list, which is the similarities. For both crochet and knitting, they use the same medium, which is yarn. In fact, you can use literally the same exact yarn for each of these crafts, which is why oftentimes on yarn labels, you won't just have like a knitting gauge. You'll also have a crochet one, just in case you could be doing crochet or knitting. And then finally, also projects. So the types of projects that you're going to be able to create are pretty much the same. It's going to be less of what can I create with this versus this, and more so why do I want to create like this with knitting versus crochet, or this with crochet over knitting. So now let's get into the differences. Let's start with crochet because that's going to be sort of our base point, or where we're working from. So crochet uses less active stitches. And what I mean by active stitches is that at one given time on your hook, you're only really going to have loops that are associated with one stitch at a time. And before you can move on to loops associated with the next stitch, you're going to have to finish up the current stitch that you're already on. Next, these pieces can only be handcrafted. So anytime you see, like at a boutique or a store, a piece that is crochet, it's most likely, or no, not most likely, it has to have been done by hand. Next, we have that crochet pieces often result in stiffer fabric. This, I hypothesize, is likely due to overall the construction of the anatomy of how it's done. So with crochet, you're stacking stitches on top of stitches. And that just doesn't necessarily, especially when you have like crowding. So you have, for one given stitch, statistically speaking, they are surrounded. So you have another stitch on the left and right and above and below it. So it doesn't really allow much room for movement. It's not to say that it's super stiff, because especially with the type of yarn that you're using, you can get a lot of stretch out of crochet. It's just to say that compared to knitting, the fabric is going to be stiffer. Next up, the hooks are going to be the same no matter what method you're using. So whether you're knitting a sock or if you're knitting a scarf, you're going to use the same exact kinds of hooks. Not necessarily the same size, but the same kind. Finally, with crochet, you're going to be using more yarn than knitting, generally speaking. I have included an article that actually goes over sort of an experiment of such that hypothesizes that crochet use more yarn than knitting, because that's kind of like a general thing that people will say. And the findings generally support that argument, but I'll let you see for yourself if you're curious as to the why and like the specifics of that. Let's move on to knitting. So unlike crochet, now you have all stitches that are active. And if you are, for instance, knitting, you'll note that you'll have a bunch of loops on the same hook. And rather than essentially working into each one individually at one time and having only one be active, all of them are active with you having the ability to go into any one at any given time. Now, obviously, in practice, you just go in the topmost one. But if you really wanted to, you could completely drop all those stitches and go into like the sixth one if you wanted to. Which, therefore, I think is why with knitting, you'll find that it's kind of easy to accidentally drop or add a stitch because of this fact. Now, next up, knitting can be replicated by machines. In fact, there are literal like knitting machines that you can buy from like craft stores or online. And that's probably why, in general, you'll find more knitted pieces offered or mass-produced, because they can be replicated by machines. With knitting, you'll find that the fabric has more drape, and that's why a lot of people like things like knitted sweaters and cardigans, because they have good drape as well as added stretchiness. Now for knitting, unlike crochet, you would use different needles for different methods, and I'll go over that in a later part of the video, but I just wanted to go ahead and put that out there now. And then finally, you use less yarn than crochet when it comes to knitting. And I think I remember reading that this is in large part because most of crochet stitches involve yarn overs of some sort. So you'll start with like a slip stitch or a single crochet, which uses only one yarn over. But then, for instance, if for half double, you're now to 2, and then double 3. And so it just continues to add up with the extra movements. However, for knitting, with the stitches that you're going to be doing, you typically only have like one yarn over, no matter what stitch it is. So that's probably in part why that's the case. For difficulty, now it is going to be subjective overall, but in general, if you ask people who do these crafts, specifically people that start with crochet, they'll often say the crochet is easier. Maybe they started and they tried with knitting and it just wasn't as intuitive or something, but they generally regard it to be easier. And I feel like that reason for that is because, one, with crochet, you only use one hook for whatever work that you're using, as opposed to with knitting, where in general, no matter what kind of knitting needles you have, it's always 2. Not only that, for crochet pieces, and I'll go over that in a little bit, it often kind of feels like it goes by quicker the time that you are actually doing it, because the movement you can complete so fast, especially with it being one hook. So there's not as much limitation on the movements that you can do. Next up, tools. So I don't need to state the obvious, which is that obviously there's a difference in the fact that crochet hooks are used for crochet and knitting needles are used for knitting. Those have those differences in themselves. But an underrated or like not as talked about tool that is kind of different, I would say, or recommended differences is the type of stitch markers that I think I would recommend for beginners. So in general, for knitting, when you're using a stitch marker, whether it be that you're doing a flat panel or a rounded piece, you probably want to go with more of a closed stitch marker design because you don't want it coming off, and for the most part it's not going to get nestled on there. It's staying on because it's between two stitches, so you really don't need them to be opened per se, but they can be opened. Whereas for crochet, I would really recommend something that's more open or openable because you're constantly like taking it off with your hand. And so recommending things like locking markers or split ring markers because they're very easy to like at the end of a row or at the beginning of a row move it. Next up, we have methods. Now, for crochet, you use crochet hooks, so there's not really much interest there, especially because this is a video about knitting. But for knitting, you have, your different methods, you're going to have different types of needles. And I'm going to go over the specifics, but right now I'm just going to outline them. So you have double pointed knitting needles, which are these right here. You have circular knitting needles, like these, and then you have flat knitting needles like these. The primary or big differences other than aesthetics would be what you're actually using them for. And again, we're going to go over those really soon. Projects. I've already kind of talked about this, but in general, the projects that you complete for each of these crafts is pretty much the same. You can do the same kinds of pieces and you use the same kind of yarn. The only exception would be things like crochet thread, which is used for like very dainty, very small pieces. But in general, if you want to make a blanket, for instance, you can have your choice between if you want it to be a knit blanket or a crochet blanket. Same thing with scarves, bags, socks, hats, you name it. That's not even like a full list. Then we have project duration. I hinted at this before, but knitting on average may take 2 to 3 times more to complete than crochet. And this is a conclusion that I got from an article that I will link where, similar to the debate over like which craft uses more yarn, there was a experiment done to see which craft took longer at the time. And in general, the hypothesis was that knitting might take 2 to 3 times more. Now, I don't want that to scare you because I know that oftentimes, like, obviously you're going to want to choose a thing that doesn't take as long because then you can get more done. But there are plenty of other benefits to knitting, even if it does take more time, that I've kind of already hinted at before. So just keep that in mind, that if you really do want to learn knitting or take knitting on, that this is a hypothesis, this is a general conclusion, but that like people have like hacks and different things to also make knitting go by faster, and it also is in general gonna depend on what's more natural and like intuitive for you. So basically take this with a grain of salt if you're really committed to actually learning. Next up, we have the materials that you would use for knitting. So a lot of these, especially if you're coming from a crochet background, are probably very like familiar. So you have the yarn, which is our medium. You have the actual knitting needles themselves, which is the primary / only difference in this case, which is what you're going to be using on your yarn to make your fabric. You have stitch markers, which you use to mark the stitches, whether they be at the beginning, end, if you have to mark off stitches for like a neck hole or sleeves. You have scissors for cutting the yarn, and then tapestry needles for weaving in your ends. This leads us to the discussion of actually like the needles that we outlined before. What needles should you buy, or what do you use each of the needles for? So there's 3 classifications. First up, we have flat knitting needles. And how I describe them is essentially when someone thinks of someone that knits, they think of someone sitting in a chair. And these are often the knitting needles that they see or they picture in their head, where it's a set of 2, one side is pointed, the other has like this stopper on it, and it's just flat, long knitting needles. This is the more traditional kind, and they're used for knitting like flat pieces that are non-rounded. So think things like scarves, blankets, maybe panels for if you're doing like a cardigan or something like that. That's what those are used for. Next up, we have double pointed knitting needles, or DPNs for short. And so these, similarly to the flat knitting needles, are pointed as well, but they're pointed on both sides. And rather than coming in a set of 2, you're often going to buy these in a set of 4 or 6. And the reason is because these are used for knitting in the round for smaller circumferences. And so if you, for instance, have a sock or a sleeve where, for the sock, for instance, you start with the actual like foot part or the heel, and you're going to the toe where it has to be a significantly smaller circumference, you're going to use these and arrange them sort of in a similar orientation like this. And essentially you're taking the stitches off of the circular knitting needles and you're dispersing them along these hooks, or sorry, not these hooks, these needles, and you're going around in a similar motion, but in this case you're using 3 different hooks. It can be a little intimidating, and I myself don't really use them very often because of that, but if you did want to like knit these types of objects, then you could, and this was the way you'd go about it whenever your circular knitting needles are just too long for the size. Finally, we have circular knitting needles. Now these are going to be knitting needles that are shorter, and that's because the tubing it takes up that length that you lose out on for the actual hook, and they're made to be attached to plastic tubing because it has less rigidity, so you're able to move it around. But these are used for knitting anything in the round, so think things like sweaters and hats. And an important thing to note for these is actually that in addition to being able to knit these projects that are actually like round and need to be connected in that way, you can also do non-round things. That's something that I found out actually quite like recently, and it made so much sense after I found that out, but it was like, I was like, wow, I didn't even, that's crazy. You would just essentially turn it after every row rather than continuing on in circular motion. Next up, we're going to be discussing stitches and techniques. So similarly to crochet, where you have like single crochet, double, half double, and all these like fundamental stitches make up more advanced stitches. For knitting, you have 2 primary stitches, and from there you will have advanced stitches as well that are just combinations and iterations of these 2 stitches. In addition to talking about those basic techniques and stitches, we're also going to go over knitting in the round, specifically how you would actually get your piece to start in the round. So similarly to crochet, where you have the magic ring that you have to establish and start, you have something similar, or you have a similar tactic that you need to use for knitting in the round. So first up, we're going to start with the knit stitch. And so I included a picture kind of outlining the steps, as well as an actual breakdown of step by step of what you would need to do. But in case I go over it and you're still confused, I also did include a article that overall goes over it, as well as a video by Sheep and Stitch where she goes over them. So first, with your stitches casted onto your hooks, no matter what kind of, or hooks, I keep saying hooks because I'm thinking about crochet. With your stitches casted onto your needles, you're going to insert your right hook from front to the back of the first stitch on your left needle. From there, you're going to yarn over. Then you're going to pull the hook, the right hook or right needle, from back to front, and then you're going to remove it from the left needle and making sure that it's placed securely onto the right needle. From there, you're going to just repeat it, and that is essentially now you're completing several knit stitches. Now, when we're talking about the purl stitch, the cool thing that I like between the knit and the purl stitch is that rather than being like similar or barely similar, they are literally the same stitch, just done backwards. So if you're doing a knit stitch, that's just the backwards of a purl stitch. And if you're doing a purl stitch, it's just the backwards or the reverse of the knit stitch. And so I wanted you to keep that in mind when you're thinking about how this is done, because especially if you're physically doing it, it might seem a little weird, but it's literally just at any point in time, just remember it's the reverse of the other. So as long as you got one of them down, you are 100% qualified to do the other one. So for the purl stitch, using your right needle, you're going to insert your needle from the back to the front of the first stitch on the left hook or left needle. You're going to yarn over, then you're going to pull from front to back, making sure that the stitch is secured onto the needle. Then you're going to remove the stitch from the left needle to the right needle and repeat. And so that's how you do purl stitches. An important thing to note, and I didn't talk about it before, is that there is a distinction. Like, let's say you have to do multiple rows and it's a combination of both purl and knit stitches. There is a way to tell the difference. Like, if you have to purl where the purl stitches are or knit where the knit stitches are, opposite, to tell like what is which. So for instance, if we go back to here, you'll note that as the knit is being done on the sides where you can see the knit, it's classified by these V's, because each time that you do a knit stitch, the result is this V shape. Whereas what you'll note is that this is more bumpy, and anytime you do a purl stitch, there is a bump. And so I'll go over it more in the coming slides, but I just wanted to point that out. So next up we have stockinette, which is just a fancy name for saying that you are going to knit one row, purl the next row, and your piece is literally just an alternation between the two kinds of stitches. And so I talked about before how when you're knitting, it results in a V versus a bump. And you can kind of see it with these two pictures. So this is the knit side of your stockinette. And it's very flat, and you can, if you look closely, see those V's that result. Whereas over here, this is the purl side, and you'll see that this is garter stitch, sorry. And with garter stitch, you knit every row, and so because you're knitting every row, it's not going to just appear as only like knit or only flat. You're going to get like an alternation sort of look, and this is kind of distinctive of it. So you have, for the purls, you can tell because it's bumpy like this. So those are two, I would say still call them basic, but they're iterations of both knitting and purling. Next up, we have knitting in the round. So there's two common methods. There's going to be one that's easier, but it kind of has, like, it doesn't look as appealing. But, I mean, from experience, I can tell you that for the most part, unless you're, like, zooming in looking for the imperfections, you really can't see it. But then there's a more seamless method that you can do as well. So we're going to go over both of them. So you're going to start by getting your stitches casted on and dispersed evenly across your knitting needles. And once you have them on there, you're going to mark just before the first stitch of your round, so right before you're about to actually start your row, and you're going to start knitting. You're going to continue all the way across, and you'll know that you finished a row once you get to the end, like the stitch marker appears again. That's your marking of being like, okay, we're done with that row, let's move on to the next one. And that's super easy. Essentially, it's just involving you not even, like, you're just starting and getting up and going. And once you start, especially, like, doing more and more rows, it's all connected. So you don't have to really do anything, and it's all going to be in the round. Now, the next one is the invisible or the seamless join method, which essentially makes it so that you don't really notice there's nothing off. Everything looks fairly connected, but there's a couple extra steps compared to the last method. So you're going to first have, your same number of stitches casted on, but now you're going to cast on an additional stitch, which is going to be on your right hook or your right needle. So then you're going to move one of your stitches over from your left needle, which now means that extra stitch that you casted on should be one below on your right needle. From there, you're going to drop the extra stitch that you moved over, or drop the extra stitch that you had casted on from the beginning. So you're going to take that stitch that's right below the first one on the right hook, and you're going to move it over that first one and just completely drop it off. From there, you're going to move the stitch that you had moved from your left hook back onto your right needle, and then place your stitch marker like normal and start knitting and repeat. Repeat the steps from the standard join method where you're knitting across and moving a stitch marker. But that's how you would get the seamless join method. It seems like it's a lot of extra steps and it's like harder, but really you're just doing like one extra stitch and dropping it in order to get this look. So it depends on what's important to you, and like if you just want something that's get up and go, this is probably more easy to understand in that way. But once you kind of have done more and more pieces and you're like looking to improve on your skills and like how your pieces look, this is probably one that you're going to want to revisit. I just thought that I would put both of them out there so that you know that they do exist. Finally, we're going to go over resources. And these are just things that I've included or resources that I've included that are going to be helpful for you when it comes to looking for inspiration slash ideas, patterns, yarn, different things like that. So we have Pinterest and Ravelry that I recommend. They're very like community based where it'll be people that are uploading their patterns either for free, some paid, or just you can see the different things that people have made and maybe like that inspires you for your own designs. There's Hobby, which sells like tools and yarn in addition to also having patterns. I found some really good free patterns there. Then there's yarn brand websites or affiliations. So think like Yarn Inspirations or Wool and the Gang, which Wool and the Gang, what I like about them is that they have patterns, they have kits you can buy that include like the yarn and the tools, and they have patterns and things and kits for both crochet as well as knitting. So it's nice in that way. And then there's Yarn Inspirations, which is one of those sites that you'll see on like a yarn label, like when you buy your yarn. And if you go on the site, you can find like tons of different like free patterns. So that's nice. That's overall going to be all for the things that I'm going to be covering. I ultimately just wanted this to be a nice intro video for those who maybe are not in the loop about knitting or you're curious about knitting and you want a little bit more insight before you make your decision on whether or not you're going to do it. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did like and enjoy the video, then please feel free to give it a like and maybe consider subscribing. Have a nice day.